So, oh, sorry. Let me check something, and we'll go. All right, so chapter 40 is basically the new world, today's world, a world without borders, or at least to some degree. There clearly are. Some key contemporary period changes. Well, socially, you get the fall of the pale male. Well, not exactly, but let's just say a reduction in their power. Political end of empires of democratization. However, both of these trends are starting to slow down or backtrack. Rise of oil and climate change is the big one. Culture, secularism, economics, globalization, etc. So, the global economic order was created in the ashes of the Second World War, in the aftermath of the Second World War, with the primary organizations being the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and World Trade Organization. They were driven and heavily influenced by the non-isolationist U.S. And as a result of this globalized economy, you get multinational corporations evolving to be truly global or transnational corporate capitalist entities. So, as a result, global corporations are untethered to any social contract and move production remorselessly to low-cost, tax-advantaged, less regulated, high-value added geography. Yeah, the whole moving to Bangladesh, or moving your factories to Mexico, Vietnam, Bangladesh, China, that sort of thing. Some of these corporations have higher GDPs than many countries, and to some, this is a threat to national sovereignty. Also, you have the U.S. corporate tax receipts dropping from 30% to 12% of the total. For example, we can see this with Pfizer moving their HQ to avoid taxes. So yeah, basically this is just, the whole top statutory corporate tax rate by OECD nations. US is actually kind of high, actually 40%. We're actually above the average of the free OECD. However, we also must understand the fact that the effective corporate tax rate has been in a steady decline since 7 years ago. However, in terms of actual average corporate tax rate, we're actually pretty low. I mean, there's a difference between the statutory and the effective. So, in one of the major shifts that you see in the world economy is the center of the world economy shifting to East Asia, due to the Asian economic miracles, in countries like South Korea, Taiwan, China, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and a bunch of other countries that are now cropping up now. This is thanks to globalization as well as their Confucian work ethic. Japan benefits from the mini Marshall Plan and Korean War reparation forgiveness, treaty limitations of defense spending, only 1%, so they can divert all that money into domestic economy. They focused on export-oriented growth that was supported by low wages. Basically, get a bunch of cheap workers and get them to produce a bunch of crap to export out of the country. And it worked. I mean, they were it appeared as if Japan's economy will overtake the U.S. by the late 1980s. Of course, then Japan's economy stagnates in what is known as the lost decade in the 90s, but whatever. So, you get, the four little tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore follow. And then you have the traditional hegemon modernizing. China, which manages to integrate elements of a market economy and benefits from a huge labor pool, basically, aka socialist basically authoritarian capitalism that falls in 1978. So you also get the rise, the quote unquote, the rise of the rest. Everyone else is suddenly rich. Emerging economies account for over 50% of the world's economic output. India is following Japan and China-ish, starting in 1990 after decades of just crappy economic growth. Latin America gradually moves from socialism to mixed economies with increasing democracy. Africa, unfortunately, remains roadkill until the millennium. So, the most famous Another major development we get with the globalized economy is the rise of the trading bloc, the most famous being the European Union. It was formed by 6 nations initially as basically a coal and steel community in 1957, but later grew to a full-fledged trading bloc. It was originally 28 until Britain said, screw it, we're leaving in 2014, bumping it down to 27. It was signed, like the EU itself was created in 1993 with the Maastricht Treaty. Basically transitioning it from a European community to a European Union. The European Union had a very nice effect of making war basically war within itself impossible because everyone's trading with each other and thus depends on each other economically to survive. The European Union eventually adopts a single currency called the euro, and as well as create something called the Schengen area. I might be mispronouncing it. Basically meaning that most of the EU is passport free. However, you do have unsettling things such as the Euro crisis from 2008 and 2015, and now with the rise of far right demagogues in countries like Hungary, Poland, Spain, France, and Britain, who vow to basically destroy the European Union and thus endanger the whole system. You also have, Ukraine's little tug of war with Russia. You also get some other trading blocs like ASEAN, NAFTA, and the Arab League. And now you have attempts to link the U.S. and Europe and the U.S. and Europe and the U.S. and East Asia. ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 1967. NAFTA, Canada, U.S., Canada, Mexico, 1994. Example of a South American will be Mercosur. Now, you also get OPEC, the oil cartel. Established in 1960, it is dominated by Arab and Muslim countries. They used to, not as anymore, but they used to have a near monopoly in the world's oil production. This gave them a crap load of power, as we saw in the oil embargo in the wake of the Yom Kippur War in the early 70s as a response to U.S. support for Israel. Now, OPEC diminished in the 80s and 90s because of overproduction and new non-members, as well as the Sunni-Shia war between Iraq and Iran. So, the question is globalization good or evil? I mean, it is efficient. It does create wealth. But is it really effective? It is kind of an untamed juggernaut, and it has the potential to enrich the few and impoverish the many. Also, the Gini coefficient is insane. Basically, that's a measure of inequality. Now, well, let me check. So basically, I gotta check something. I gotta look something up. Sorry. So basically, Gini coefficient is basically a measure of. Actually, no, I'm not gonna bother. Sorry. So Gini coefficient, by the way, is just measure of inequality. You can read all about it in the Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. You have 1 million Ohio manufacturing jobs moving, but now, however, most of the job losses due to automation. Now, communications media have tied the world together, promoting global cultural integration, and thus you get worldwide consumption of the similar cultural goods. This is basically known as Americanization or McDonaldization. The English language becomes predominant, yet you also have cultural borrowings from non-American societies as well as cultural imports, like, K-pop. You also have, Latino culture in America, with hip-hop, and various other famous, salsa, that sort of thing. Now we do have some serious. Now there are some serious global issues today, like population explosion, dire poverty for like 1 billion people, environmental destruction, racism, proliferation of WMDs. This racism issue is actually is really bad because this presentation is a little bit old. But if you ever see the news lately, you do notice a startling rise in far right movements, or at least movements that employ far-right demagogic rhetoric in countries like Hungary with the Prime Minister Viktor Orban, France with the National Front or National Rally, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, Brexit, Vox Party in Spain. Just like everywhere around the world, you see these far-right movements rising up and exploiting ethnic hatreds, and often a lot of these movements come out of countries that you would not expect. Like, for example, Poland, it suffered terribly under the Nazis. France got invaded by the Nazis. Spain had a fascist dictator. You also got rising economic inequality, diseases due to, and more specifically, antibiotic resistant diseases due to the fact that we were too reliant on antibiotics. Labor servitude, the whole Bengali workers are only paid like a few dollars a day. Not really that much. And yet, as Winston Churchill said, Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities. Physical violence has actually decreased in the world. You may not, if you read the news, you might think, what the heck? That's not even true. But look at the numbers. The number of people dying in wars, crime, whatever, has dramatically decreased over the past few decades. The average health and wealth is up, like life expectancies in really many poor countries are dramatically improving. Global population growth is slowing because as women in poor countries get more educated, get better jobs, they have fewer children. Transparency and accountability appear to be going up. We saw that with the Snowden leaks regarding NSA surveillance. And religious extremism may be waning, not so sure about that. And technological innovation is accelerating. And necessity is the mother of all invention. Now, you also get the population explosion in today's time. This isn't really a problem among wealthy countries, like the U.S., Canada, France, or South Korea or Japan. In fact, the opposite's true in some of those countries. Basically, there's just not enough people being born, so the population actually decreases because the birth rate's so low, and the death rate is also low, but still higher than the birth rate. Japan is like probably, according to my AP World History teachers, losing 1 million people a month, which is insane. Rich countries don't have a population explosion problem because the demographic transition. Basically, as the women get richer, they have fewer children because they're more educated, and they don't need them to work. But the poor, especially females, don't have the education or the literacy to employ birth control methods. They also have poor access to family planning technology. And sometimes they suffer from questionable religious dogma. The religious dogma, there's still a debate between which is more of an effect, the religious dogma issue or the economics, but both of them both are believe, at least just for now, both have an effect. For example, some religious institutions ban contraceptives, or women are basically told to do what men say. As we can see, this is basically a nice little diagram of the population, the millions. Europe's growth has stagnated. It's actually going to decrease. Latin America, it's going to greatly increase. North America, increase slightly. Oceania, not much increase now. The biggest increases we will see will be in Asia and Africa. I mean, like by the time you and I have children and already have a job, there will be 2 billion Africans. You have the issue of dire poverty, with 1 million people living on less than $1.25 a day. Also, 29,000 children at the age of 5 die every day due to things like diarrhea, malaria, neonatal infection, pneumonia, preterm delivery, or lack of oxygen at birth. Example, Haiti, Congo, Pakistan. You also have, serious environmental problems because the human population is growing. Global warming from man-made greenhouse gases is real and is already killing people. This can include things like heat waves, really strong storms, crop failures. It's floods. It's a multitude of things. Just look it up. I can't explain it entirely, but it's a mess. And there's no will or way yet found to get off our carbon addiction. We did sign a bunch of countries did sign the Paris Accords, but the United States has withdrawn from that. The whole mess. And for some developing countries, they will say, well, I'm sorry, rich countries, quit. Why are you asking us to stop developing when we want to get rich too? So it's a balance between sustainability and development. A nice little, a nice little quote is, "We are we are sleepwalking towards our own Easter Island." Economic inequality is really bad in terms of annual income, even worse regarding accumulated wealth. It's getting worse due to globalization, need for higher education, and especially deliberate policy choices driven by the rich and powerful elite. Sorry if this is sounding kind of left wing, but this is made by my AP World History teacher, who by no means strikes me as a left wing guy. But anyway, it's bad between countries, but it's especially bad between classes and races within countries. Although the economic inequality between countries is actually improving. And obviously it's not fair, but it could, in the most extreme scenarios, lead to revolutions and or gated communities. You also get labor servitude, despite the fact that slavery was abolished in Saudi Arabia and Angola in the 60s. You still get forced indenture remaining in place in the developing world. Holding roughly 250 million people in bondage. You also have a global trafficking of human slaves, whether they be sex slaves or labor slaves or whatever. 1 to 2 million annually, mostly girls and women. Really sad. It's it's unfortunately one of the fastest growing and most lucrative criminal enterprises in the world, and it may overtake drugs soon. You also have global diseases like the old enemies like TB and malaria, new ones like Ebola and AIDS, and the threat is present throughout the world, but it's really bad in the developing world because because those countries don't often have the necessary medicines, the necessary infrastructure and medications and doctors to deal with these situations. 80% of the children, for example, 80% of the children worldwide who have AIDS live in Africa. You also have global terrorism. Definition of terrorism is deliberate, systematic use of violence against civilians. It's cheaper and more effective than conventional war, and thus it's accessible to smaller groups that might not have a lot of money. Examples include 9/11, religious wars, sectarian violence, and there's a scary possibility of handheld nukes. I mean, the Russians, the Soviets, made a bunch of suitcase nukes, and they disappeared. So yikes. Now, that sounds all gloomy to me. Okay, so anyway, you do have the United Nations, which superseded the League of Nations because the League was a failure, and its charter is gives it power to maintain maintains international peace and security. However, it was really weak, especially during the Cold War, because it was being torn apart by Cold War politics, especially between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now it is. And to this day, it's still pretty weak in military areas. Especially if you look at the Yugoslav wars, UN peacekeepers weren't often effective in preventing ethnic cleansing campaigns. Now, they have been influential in public health campaigns like eradicating smallpox. They've also supported universal human rights. They also help bring stability that helps the global economy. Now, another major important trend is the urbanization, as well as interconnectivity between countries, supply chains superseding borders. Now, I know I usually sign off on here, but apparently, I want to end off. This is the end of the whole series of videos, and you might think, oh god, that's all gloomy doomy. Jeez. Well, you also have to keep in mind, yes, on one hand things are pretty bad, but on the other hand you must also consider things are actually getting better. I mean, the share of people who live in extreme poverty is the lowest it has ever been in history. Yes, it's still a lot of people, but it's the lowest percentage. That's progress. Also, life expectancies are improving, wars are going down, violence is going down. Generally, over time, people just become more accepting of people who aren't of their religion, race, gender, or whatever. But of course, we must also remember that work needs to be done. Racial inequality, dire poverty. There's still people dying in wars. You also get often these really ugly reactionary governments that often rise up. So yeah. Hopefully you can change the world.